Hi, I'm James Nelson, Principal and Head of Tri-State Investment Sales for Avison YuhTyng, and I'm here to bring you the Nelson Report for September 2019. Welcome back. Hope you all had a great summer. So we are here today to talk about the Climate Mobilization Act, and I'm here with YuhTyng Patka, who is a partner at Duval and Stachenfeld, and she co-chairs their task force to address this very important topic. And Jeff Carleton from Carleton Energy Consulting, who's actually been doing energy benchmarking since its inception. He's an auditing company who works with the likes of Related, Columbia University, and so we'll be talking about this very important topic as well. And Jeff, I think you also do some, you're on the which council? What was it?
I'm on the advisory council with Urban Green.
Perfect.
Green
Okay, great. So we've got the experts here for you. So Ting, to start off, this Climate Mobilization Act, I believe it was the city council that passed this. It was a series of bills. We're going to be talking specifically about some of the local laws created, but just maybe give us kind of the overall description of the program and what owners can expect to see from here.
Right, James. So the Climate Mobilization Act was a series of bills that was passed by the New York City City Council back in April. And the purpose of the Climate Mobilization Act, or CMA for short, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by year 2030 and 80% by year 2050. So to achieve these lofty goals, the Climate Mobilization Act is a series of bills to encourage and require New York City residents to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The highlight of the CMA is Local Law 97, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and that's a statutory cap on greenhouse gas emissions of buildings, large buildings, 25,000 square feet or larger in New York City. In addition to Local Law 97, there's also laws in the CMA addressing a requirement for green roofs. There's also a bill that's encouraging an easier development of wind turbines in the city. And there's also important legislation enabling PACE financing, which stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, and it's a way of financing retrofits for the buildings to comply with Local Law 97, the greenhouse gas emissions cap.
Great. So a lot to discuss, and that last piece might help in financing some of these required retrofits. But just to be clear, because I know when this was passed, I mean, a lot of the real estate industry was really focused on rent regulation and the reform, and it really took center stage. And when, speaking to clients and owners about this, because it is a couple years off, many have said, well, I've heard that the Durst building at 1 Bryant Park failed or wouldn't meet the standard, and that's LEED Platinum. How can that even be possible? I remember there was a story that said de Blasio said no more glass and steel allowed in the city. And so I think the general impression was, well, this has got to change. There's no way this will stand. But to be clear, this has been passed, even though de Blasio did not sign it into effect. But the fact that he, I guess, remained silent on this, this does go into law. Is that correct?
Right, that's correct. A certain majority of City Council approved these bills, which in effect made them into law after a certain number of days upon approval of the bills. So these laws have been passed and will be law and will become effective by this fall.
Okay. So, Jeff, you've been doing energy benchmarking now for, is it 10 years?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay. So, and we were speaking before, and you said, so the city has been tracking carbon emissions, and it is publicly available, but now this is really the first time when there are going to be repercussions if these buildings do not meet the standard by and Ting, I know you mentioned the goal by 2030, but Jeff, my understanding is by 2025 there could be financial implications if a building does not qualify. So can you tell us a little bit about what's in store for the next couple of years, and then how are you preparing your clients' owners to deal with this?
Sure. Thanks, James. So every building in New York City that's over 50,000 square feet in the past few years, I think starting in 2012 or 11, has been required to file as energy consumption. And most owners either do it themselves or they hire somebody. They just put the information in the system. No one pays any attention to it, really, and it hasn't really been on anyone's radar.
So it's self-reported.
It can be self-reported, or they hire a consulting firm to put it in for them. But the long and the short of it is, it's just been violation avoidance. It's just, we have to file our energy consumption. Let's just put it in. We get it done by May 1st, and we don't get a $500 fine.
Right, and this is for 50,000 square feet or above. Ting just said that now the requirement's going to be for buildings above 25,000 feet.
Last year, they dropped it to 25,000 square feet, had to benchmark their information. But the short of it is, everyone's just been doing this to avoid violation. So it started with 50,000 square feet, and then last year we had to file buildings 25,000 square feet. During this time, the city has been tracking this information in it's called the EPA Portfolio Manager. That manager is pushing a score from 1 to 100 for each building in New York City. So what's going on, so there are two sets of goals that the city sort of put together. By the end of 2024, by 2025, buildings that currently have an energy score between 1 and 20 are in a position to get a fine for poor energy consumption. There are exceptions like rent-stabilized buildings, which I'll get into. And then by 2030, based on this energy score, they have to really reduce their energy consumption significantly to avoid a fine.
Mm-hmm. So, Ting, how are you advising your clients right now to deal with this? Are you, because I would imagine maybe many will say, well, I don't have to deal with this till 2024 or 2025. I'm assuming you're going to tell our listeners that getting on this sooner than later would probably be a good idea.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There is this misconception that an owner can kind of put this off for a little bit because compliance is not required until January 1 of 2024. So most owners are like, oh, that's 5 years down the line. However, owners need to be aware that there is a July 1, 2021 deadline for a submission of an application for an adjustment where the adjustment is increasing a carbon cap if a building owner doesn't feel like they will be able to comply with the statutory limits that are currently in place. So what I've been advising building owners is to act sooner than later to first determine whether or not you currently are in compliance, because there's a chance that the newer buildings already are in compliance and that they don't need to do anything. To determine whether or not you're in compliance, the law right now establishes statutory limitations for years 2024 through 2029. So that's one tranche. So therefore, if you're in compliance for 2024, you're good for the following 5 years. And then in 2030, those statutory limitations on greenhouse gas emissions tighten up a little bit more. So just because you're in compliance in 2024 doesn't indicate that you'll be in compliance in 2030 as well. So all the more reason why owners right now need to determine compliance by first checking to see what is their statutory limitation and then what is their actual emissions. And to determine what their actual emissions is, they would hire somebody like Jeff here to help them assess that.
Got it. And I believe, and you gave a great panel on this, you had said that the program was designed to fail roughly 20% of the buildings by 2025, meaning that at least 20% of the buildings are not in compliance right now. So, and then obviously the requirements are going to get that much stricter. So, but you did mention that there are some opportunities, and Jeff said if it has rent regulation, I believe, if it's a not-for-profit, and then we also talked about high usage because, again, a building, I keep going back to One Bryant Park, but that's a building that's highly, highly utilized. You have, bench seating, you have a lot of people using that building, and this is not just 9 to 5, early in the morning till late at night, you would think that would be a good thing, right? Because you have an intense use of the building as opposed to having half the amount of workers there in 2 separate buildings. So are buildings like that going to be exempt?
Right. So there are certain buildings that are going to be completely exempt from these statutory caps. Those buildings are, for example, city-owned buildings, NYCHA buildings, notably buildings with at least one rent-regulated unit. Those such buildings that are exempt from the statutory carbon cap are required to comply with a lesser strict requirement under the law, where in a nutshell, the owners have to certify that they have done their best to create an energy efficient building, such as they have to certify that they have weather stripped their windows, that they have that they have insulated pipes, and they have replaced thermostats. So those are buildings that are exempt from the cap. Buildings that are high density usage, or have a tenant that uses a lot of energy, like someone that has a lot of servers or trader or something, those kinds of buildings may qualify for an adjustment that I mentioned earlier, where they have to apply by July 1 of 2021. Such buildings that have high density, or if you have a physical limitation, such as a landmarked building, or you have difficulty accessing your systems, or there's a lease in place preventing the owner from accessing systems, or if there's a financial limitation, for example, that compliance will affect an owner's reasonable rate of return. In those instances, those buildings are not exempt from the law, but they may qualify for an adjustment to their otherwise statutory cap as laid out in the law.
Got it. So, and those are the exceptions. But Jeff, for the buildings that do not meet the standards, so if it is that, I don't know if you've heard that 20% figure of buildings that will not pass, maybe you could walk us through how do you find out. Again, I believe that there is a website that the city has that actually shows what the score is, and then how you determine what is, because the penalties, I understand, are quite severe, and then compared to what is the cost to address those issues and retrofit.
Right. The first thing that an owner should do, because this legislation, there's a lot of different years and different terms, the first thing that an owner should do is, in our opinion, is look at your 2024 goal. Look at your energy score and see where you currently are right now. We went through the potential cost of hitting your 2024 goals, are considered sort of operational changes, light retrofitting, like a lighting upgrade, or potentially looking at controls, sort of basic, sort of common sense items. Hey, when everyone leaves this building, do we turn the lights off? Do we turn the boiler off? Do we turn the heating system on the weekend when no one is here? So an owner should go through each building. They should see, are they in line for a 2024 score? They should implement as many common sense measures as possible to bring down their base energy consumption to as low a point as possible. To me, that's a starting point to look at 2030. So, yes, and your energy score, which you should have an energy score for each building. Any energy score between 1 and 20 puts you in line for a carbon tax fine. The fine for the carbon tax is $268 per extra metric ton, in comparison to how much the city thought a building should be using. If you have an energy score of a 1, for example, you may have a 60,000 square foot multifamily building running extremely poorly, would be in line for almost $100,000 fine for
in every year. I mean, this isn't a one-time
yes, and
fine.
It's an annual
this
fee.
is an annual fine until the problem is corrected.
And I consider it like a runaway train, a building that it may be just being bypassed. And there's been no efficiency thought whatsoever. Has an energy score of a 1, could be a really, really severe fine if it's not addressed. A building with an energy score of a 16 or an 18 may be in line for a much, much smaller fine. But the first thing an owner needs to do is look at every building, look at their energy score, and see where they are for their 2024 filing.
Right. And I know you were kind enough because for me, and looking at the financial impact of these properties, or of this new local law, looking at what is the cost of the fine versus what is the cost of the upgrade, and trying to understand how investors might want to address that. So I think you were kind enough to do a case study. I think a 30,000 square foot building, and so maybe you can walk us through the numbers on that.
Sure. So yeah, I did a small case study. A poor performing commercial building with a score of a 16, which is not a horrible building, but it's well below the requirements. At this point in time, if they do nothing, they're in line for a $10,000 annual fine come 2024. Based on the Urban Green Council study of like a light retrofit, operational changes at 50 cents a square foot, you're looking at roughly $16,000 needed to save the $10,000 fine, in addition to saving on your operating costs. When you get to 2030, however, their projected fine, and this is for a 33,000 square foot building, would be $45,000. So that's where the fine would get very, very significant. We estimate it would cost about $330,000, about about $10 per square foot to fix this building. So you're looking at an ROI of about 7 years, basically spending $330,000 to save $45,000. That's why it's extremely important to try and lower your baseline so you don't do a project for 2030 that's too big. Just giving you an example, if you have really inefficient lights running all the time, you're better off solving that before hiring an engineering firm to do a study on solar panels. Just that's a small example.
Right. So the initial for the 2024-25, it's really what you call behavioral, as far as making adjustments to usage and really, which would seem to make sense anyways, right? I would imagine in the process, owners would be lowering their utility bills, and then but when you're talking about the higher thresholds, then you're talking about, you mentioned solar panels. If it's windows, I mean that becomes obviously more expensive. But do you have any studies on the economic benefit?
Sure, and we did that along with Urban Green. Essentially, a light upgrade to a building is roughly going to give you like a 15% savings. It is different for commercial and residential, but we consider a light cost for a residential building to be about between $1 and $2 a square foot, whereas a commercial about $1.50 to $4. That's for that initial sort of controls, really following the prescriptive plan that the city outlined. When you get into a deep retrofit, if you need to save roughly 35% or more to hit your goals, you're looking at between $7 and $12 for a residential building and $15 to $18 for a commercial building.
Okay.
That's dollars per square foot.
Right. So far we've really been looking at the financial impact, and it might be on a lot of investors' minds, but let's talk about the impact on the environment. I mean, do we think this is a good idea when we look at New York compared to, I don't know, San Francisco or maybe Shanghai or London? I mean, do you have any sense of how we stack up, and is this something that needs to be addressed? And then I guess part B is, do we think this is the right way for this to be addressed? So this might get a little more into kind of the political arena, but just curious your thoughts on the effectiveness of what's being proposed here, and does it make sense?
Sure. As an energy auditor, I can tell you, we visit a lot of buildings that are just polluting the environment for absolutely no reason at all. Just, if you walk into a typical building in New York City when it's 20 degrees outside, you walk into an apartment and most people have their windows open or their radiators closed and they're wearing shorts and T-shirts. So there is a culture of waste at a lot of buildings, and a lot of buildings in New York City are heated or cooled to the point of nobody complaining. And I think it's a really, really bad habit. That combined with, energy prices haven't been all that expensive in the past few years, combined with in the last, decade real estate value growth. It's just not a lot of people have been focused on energy efficiency. I think this is a good first step towards 2024 to say, hey, you can't run a building and have no plan for energy efficiency. Whereas, like, you have to put in a prescriptive plan. You have to do the basics to run an efficient building, and I think it gets rid of people just ignoring energy efficiency. So I think it's effective in that regard.
But Tyng, going back to the question about a LEED Platinum building that might not qualify, or the notion that glass and steel no longer works. I mean, do you have any thoughts on if this this new reform is rational?
Well, there's a portion in the law that that acknowledges certain buildings that might not be able to comply under normal circumstances. For example, these high-density 24/7 office buildings, or buildings whose tenants are technology tenants who have high-energy servers in place. So the law does take into account these kinds of uses and the owners and tenants, and allows for the owner to apply for an adjustment on their carbon cap.
Okay, so they do account for buildings that should be used.
Right. The law the law recognizes that. Like that the 24/7 office buildings should not be compared to the same standard as those that are not run 24/7.
So that's helpful. Jeff, so there's been a lot of advancement in green technology, for lack of a better term. I've got I know an owner who's building a passive apartment building. Can you tell us a little bit about the advancements that are out there today? What are some of these practices that make sense? If someone is gut renovating a building, they have a vacant building, what should they be thinking about for their heating systems, for utilities? What type of advancements are you recommending to clients right now?
Sure. So if for existing buildings, it's mainly building controls, basically heating and cooling controls, really the basics of turning items on and off when they don't need to be running, and using the utilities or NYSERDA or Con Edison, National Grid, to contribute towards some of these retrofits, like controls or lighting or anything like that. For newer buildings, there's a big push towards electrification and heat pumps rather than central heating systems that have to run all winter and typically have to run all summer to provide just hot water to a 200-unit building. So electrification, separating domestic hot water production from your steam or your heating plant is very, very common. So those are the main things. Some condensing hot water boilers are highly efficient compared to older ones.
And the premise behind passive, and is that a trend that you see continuing?
So it's interesting because a passive home is an opportunity to build a structure essentially with a fantastic insulation value. By preventing cold air from blowing in, it allows you to use a ton less energy inside. The problem that a lot of these buildings are going to have towards hitting their 2030 goal is that the insulation and the R values of a lot of these existing buildings are really, really poor. So aspects of a passive house, of a high insulation exterior, I think are going to be needed in order to hit 2030 goals. I think there are a lot of buildings that we're looking at and saying, hey, we can't drop our, for example, office buildings, it's almost a 50% reduction by 2030, but you need to run air conditioning. So it's interesting because the passive home, the trouble that a lot of the exterior of these older buildings have is going to prevent 2030, and I believe improving the facades and improving the R value of the structure is going to be critical towards 2030 goals.
So it would seem we're almost headed towards a passive standard is another way to look at it?
I think so, yeah. Absolutely.
And the R values, just for the listeners?
Roughly 35, and you may have a...
But could you define them? What is the...
I'm not an expert on passive home, but I think the R value for an exterior and a roof may be roughly 35, where if we go to an existing pre-war building with no insulation on a roof, you're talking about an R value of 7.
Got it.
So you're talking about a massive improvement in the insulation and the tightness of the envelope.
So, Ting, changing gears here, and you mentioned PACE financing in the intro. So, tell us how that works, because I'm sure a lot of owners right now are saying, wow, this could be a couple $100,000. And again, Jeff's stats were for a 30,000 square foot building. So there's going to be real numbers here. But luckily, it sounds like there are some financing vehicles that can be helpful here. So can you tell us about the type of financing that's available?
Sure. So City Council, once again, they had in mind that retrofits are going to be required for compliance for the most part, and owners are going to be asking, how am I going to afford these retrofits? So the city understood that PACE financing is a key component to compliance with Local Law 97. And PACE financing is a unique mechanism of financing because it primes the mortgage. PACE financing is a special assessment on your real estate tax bill. So it is treated the same as real property taxes, which most of our listeners understand come before a mortgage. So historically, mortgage lenders did not take well to PACE. A lot of mortgage lenders expressly prohibit PACE financing in their loan documents because they don't want anything priming their mortgage. But now, for the first time in New York City, PACE is being authorized to provide loans in New York City. PACE is provided by private lenders, and we think that it's going to be a really interesting, exciting opportunity for lenders that adopt PACE early on.
So do you think the conventional lenders will have their own PACE arms and maybe offer them alongside a traditional mortgage?
I think the traditional lenders will definitely have to get comfortable with PACE real fast or lose a competitive advantage.
Right. And what type of term and rates? I mean,
so PACE loans are competitive fixed rates. Right now, they're about 5.5% to 6.5%, and they amortize over the useful life of the energy efficient improvement.
Perfect. Well, great. Well, this has been a really helpful discussion. I don't know if, Jeff, if you have any closing thoughts, if there's anything we missed, or parting words.
No, I think I kind of divide, in my mind, I've just divided this legislation into two parts. The way I see it is 2024 is sort of common sense, and where common sense measures will get you to hopefully avoid fines. 2030 is where the rubber hits the road, and it's going to be an interesting challenge to see how owners and consultants respond to hitting what I consider very, very ambitious goals.
Got it. And I am now remembering there was one question that I wanted to ask, because we've just been talking about the city's requirements, but if I'm not mistaken, the state has requirements as well. So I don't know if you want to speak on that, or Ting, any idea of what's coming down the pipe for that?
To be honest, I haven't really wrapped my head around the state's requirements. I don't know if Jeff has familiarized himself with it yet.
Not as much. It has more to do. It has a lot more to do with how the actual energy is generated. But yeah, I mean, it's all along the same lines of reduction. But right now, our focus is just taking buildings and getting them ready for 2024. And then the state has other goals to further increase, to further decrease it. But that comes not necessarily from building consumption. It's simply like the electricity that's coming to the building. How is that generated? Was that generated by wind or solar, which was before it gets to the building? Right.
So Ting, any more closing thoughts? And the one other question I had for you was, because at your panel you had mentioned that for some buildings that exceed the levels, is there a chance that, I know you have brownfield credits for cleanup. I mean, is there a chance that there will be a market, an exchange where these credits could be sold?
That's where it looks like it's heading, James. The law does put in place an advisory council to look into carbon trading, but right now there is no clarity regarding what that market is going to look like or how it's going to be implemented, but it's definitely something that the city has contemplated and will look into. As far as my closing remarks, my advice to clients is to pay attention to this and act now, because the CMA will affect every single person related to real estate in New York City, whether or not you're an owner or a landlord, tenant, buyer, seller, lender, borrower. It's going to be on everybody's due diligence checklists. So it's definitely important to get up to speed on this sooner than later.
No question. Well, I want to thank you both for coming in. Really important topic, which I don't think is getting enough airplay. I mean, I know everyone kind of has a sense that this is happening, but as far as the real implications and what to do now as opposed to waiting several years when it might be too late, really helpful conversation. So thank you again both for coming in.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Look forward to talking to you all in the coming days and weeks, and looking forward to a good fall. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.